should we eat?
We humans are far closer to a chimpanzee than a chimpanzee is even to a dog.
A docuseries about our complex relationship with animals. Watch now on YouTube. DW Documentary.
My name is Sonam Devi. I have 3 kids.
My name is Siva Mallikarjuna Reddy, age 33. I believe in doing, just do.
My name is Simran Sani. I like reporting, moving from one village to another.
Financially, we are very strong. I thank the gods for my family.
This is India's new generation. What are their dreams in the world's most populous country? What do they want to change in a society full of contrasts? The Indian Age starts June 5th on DW.
Welcome to Ask DW, also being live streamed on YouTube. I'm Melissa Chan, and this is a special format where those of you tuning in have an opportunity to pose questions. Today, it's all about China landing a spacecraft on the far side of the moon for the second time. It marks another advance for China as an international race in space gathers pace. The U.S., India, and others are hoping to build permanent bases on the moon or on Mars. They are also eyeing potential lunar mineral resources, which could be exploited in the future. We are joined by 2 awesome guests who are standing by to respond to your questions and comments. You can type them into the chat on YouTube. For your science and space questions, we have Keith Cowing. He's the editor of NASAWatch.com and trained as an astrobiologist. And to look more in depth at the geopolitics behind this rush to the moon, we have journalist David Ariosto. He's the creator of the Space Watch Daily podcast and co-author of an upcoming book on the 21st century space race called Open Space, the races behind a space-borne renaissance. So welcome to both of you, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
While you are sending us your questions, let's take a closer look at China's Chang'e 6 mission to the moon.
A Chinese spacecraft carrying European instruments. Launched at the beginning of May, Chang'e 6 has reached the far side of the moon. Scientists from Europe are looking forward to sharing the results of a series of experiments there.
What impresses me a lot in the case of China and of the moon program is the very powerful roadmap that has been set up. So far, they've always been successful, so we are very confident that Chang'e 6 will work okay.
It is not the first time that a Chinese spacecraft has landed on the far side of the moon. In 2019, the Chang'e 4 mission sent a rover there, which is still operating today. Now, the much bigger and heavier Chang'e 6 is set to collect rock samples from the far side and bring them back to Earth. And it is carrying other specialized scientific equipment too, including from Toulouse. French scientists at the Institute for Astrophysics and Planetology spent several years developing a radon detector for the moon's far side. They built several identical modules. The one we see here is identical to the device installed on board Chang'e 6. Worsening geopolitical tensions could pose a threat to the more than 3 decades-long European-Chinese space cooperation and potentially make future lunar missions together less likely.
It is a question to see. You have the International Lunar Robotic Stations, which is a Sino-Russian initiative. And it depends if the Chang'e 7 or Chang'e 8 missions, if they are part of the ILRS, then it will be very difficult or actually impossible for Europe to cooperate on these missions.
For the moment, though, the European-Chinese cooperation on lunar missions is running smoothly. Besides the French radon detector, there is also equipment from Sweden and Italy on board, as well as from Pakistan.
The principle is that we don't exchange funds. One institution provides the transport and the system, the other institution provides the instrument, and the results are are shared on an equal basis.
Despite the political challenges, scientists want to cooperate on future lunar and even Mars missions. And in the meantime, Chang'e 6 is scheduled to return to Earth at the end of June.
So you've heard a bit about China's Chang'e 6 mission. Now it's time to get the conversation started. As a reminder, with Keith Cowing, the editor of NASAWatch.com, and David Ariosto, author of the upcoming book, Open Space. While we're waiting for questions and comments, and don't be shy, I'm going to kick things off. Keith, how big a deal is this far side of the moon landing?
Well, it's something that the U.S. thought about doing 50 years ago, but never did. They actually talked about landing a human mission back there. And the moon, I'll pick up my little prop here, we see one side of it very well, but the other side, the far side, is still a bit of a mystery, even though we've been orbiting it for years. And these samples that we're bringing back will give us a good idea of at least how similar and how different these two sides of the moon are. So, and that alone makes it important. But the fact that China has had a very steady, progressive way of building upon the success of each mission, such that each one is more complex, again, is very important. And if you look at some of the artwork that China has about what their manned or crewed mission will look like, and you look at the bottom of the spacecraft, and then you look at the Chang'e 6, it's just a smaller version. So there's a lot of methodical thinking here in how you, again, go up to the point where you put people in the mission and they land on the moon. So it's important, important, important.
And just to confirm and clarify, China is the only country to have landed a craft on the far side of the moon? And that goes to Keith.
Yeah, twice.
Okay, and so David, I'm curious, the same question for you, but from a geopolitical perspective, how big a deal is this far side of the moon landing?
Yeah, you know, I think it's one of these things that kind of gets a little bit overlooked in terms of the sheer magnitude of the science behind it, right? Because like to do this type of mission is certainly a sophisticated one. It involves an orbiter, a lander, an ascender, a reentry module. You know, it's looking at the South Pole Aitken Basin, which is frankly just a more difficult area to land in by virtue of the topography there. But what this constitutes is a bit of a transition now into the implementation phase of developing CEST lunar infrastructure, which the Chinese space program is going to need as it starts to look for that permanent human presence on the moon. And the importance of the South Pole, obviously, is if you're looking to make the moon sort of your gas station for the rest of the solar system, if you're looking to do trips to Mars, the asteroid belt, other parts of the solar system, you know, there's water there. The water amounts to potentially as much as Lake Michigan from reports that I've seen. You know, and the way you do that is you cleave the molecules. You get hydrogen and oxygen. You can essentially make fuel out of that. So you get in situ resource development there. But then there's also other minerals and resources. But you know, when you look at future aspects of this, there's an isotope, a non-radioactive isotope called helium-3 that is sort of a premier type of fuel that can be used in future nuclear fusion experiments. So as we kind of extrapolate about what advanced propulsion systems might look like decades in the future, this type of fuel could be instrumental into it. So, you know, in terms of China's play, the moon obviously is and really CEST lunar space is at this point, you know, kind of the ultimate high ground militarily, both in terms of you know, what it's developing in terms of some of the kinetic capacities of its weaponry. Long term, right now that mostly orients around direct energy weaponry and sort of anti-satellite kind of infrastructure. But you know, long term, we're looking at this as a power play, both in terms of the geopolitics, but also sort of the economic wherewithal of establishing a presence there.
And I actually want to share some of the stuff that's already coming in from chat. Dale Dulles says, good afternoon, everyone. What does this expedition mean for China and space exploration in general, which we are examining right now? Here's a question from somebody called One Janus. Is there any world organization that gives permission for moon missions? What if a country decided to do a nuke test on the moon? And that is a question for both of you guys. Let's turn to Keith first.
Well, there are treaties that have been in place for more than half a century that most nations have signed up to, which govern activities in space and no weapons and things like that. So that is, it's sort of like the Antarctic Treaty. We have half a century of pretty much global agreement to that. We have a new thing here, at least in the West, the Artemis Accords, which is adding countries from around the world, which try and come up with a sort of rules of play and behavior on the moon. However, China doesn't exactly see it that way, and Russia isn't friends with anybody right now. And so, long story short, I think the model to look at to some extent is Antarctica. And I've been on expeditions to the Arctic and the Himalayas, and I've been in that regime. And people, when you go to a remote, far away, difficult to get to, dangerous place, tend to want to cooperate, and they want to know their neighbors in the next base are there to help them if something happens. And I've seen this happen. That said, it's outer space, and you don't know what's going to happen. And politics sometimes makes absolutely no sense to us scientist types, but it makes complete sense to the geopolitical thinkers. And I'll leave it to my fellow guest here to explain that to us, because I still don't understand all of it.
Yeah, I mean, David, pick up from where Keith left off. Scientists and geopolitics doesn't often mix. I mean, we see this a lot. Scientists, whether it's with space or with viruses, tend to really want to collaborate, work together across borders. But the situation from a geopolitical perspective is very different.
It's interesting. I mean, he makes a great point in the sense, particularly in terms of the Arctic, right? There's a lot of collaboration. Anywhere where it's really difficult to operate, you tend to put sort of, bygones be bygones, put that behind you just to kind of survive up there. And it was a hallmark of the first space race, during the first Cold War, frankly, between, American astronauts and Russian cosmonauts. There was always this sense that, despite what was happening geopolitically down here on Earth, up there, they just sort of found a way to work together, and it was emblematic on the ISS, and even in the technology, sort of the interoperable nature of the technology that they used. That's not happening now, with regard to a couple of things. One, the technology is not interoperable. The Chinese were excluded from the ISS, and they went out and established their own space station. Second, the Wolf Amendment that was established back in 2011, that was, really almost in response to some of the human rights abuses with regard to the Uyghur population, prevented collaboration between NASA and really any sort of state-funded enterprise with the Chinese agency. Now, the Chinese, the vast majority of their space efforts run through the PLA, People's Liberation Army, and so at very least, from an optics perspective, it's hard to kind of have that same kind of collaboration when you have a civilian agency with NASA collaborating with a military arm. This is actually something in my conversations with those within the Chinese commercial sector have expressed some frustration about, in the sense that, we want to work with other groups. I was speaking with the founder of Orion Space, who put together essentially China's largest and most powerful solid fuel rocket in the commercial space. And he draws a lot of inspiration from what Elon Musk is doing. And he studied in San Francisco. And so he's got a lot of ties to the United States. But, there's a prohibition in terms of that collaboration at the state level. It's hindered by additional sanctions. And, we're kind of reaching a place now in terms of how Beijing and Washington operate, that it's affecting how we have traditionally operated, even the most extreme environments. You see that obviously with Vladimir Putin and his questions about nuclear weapons in space. So, you marry that with the advent of all of these incredibly powerful and dangerous new technologies, particularly hypersonics. And we're really entering sort of this brave new world in terms of the level of the level of number of players and private players in this sort of new space race, and the stakes that are involved between all of these adversarial rivals that are coming to a head now, this ultimate high ground.
I've been listening to both of you talk about this, but I'm still a little confused, so I'd love clarification. You mentioned the International Space Station, but my understanding is even within the last 2 years, we've seen U.S. and Russian astronauts up there. So there is this kind of collaboration, and I understand with this Chang'e 6 mission, the European Space Agency had some kind of collaboration as well. So it seems like there's a lot of contradiction with, cooperating and not cooperating. Can you enlighten us a little bit more on that? Maybe let me stick with David just because you just were talking about it, and then I also want to go to Keith for that as well. And we have a question, I'm told, right after this that we're going to pull up from one of the viewers.
Yeah, sure. So there actually is I believe there's a cargo resupply ship that's heading to the ISS currently, or was just launched last week. So you're right, there is a collaboration there, and it's interesting, right? Because the U.S. used to rely on Russia for a long period of time just to get to the ISS. This is back, back 2011 when, under the Obama administration, the shuttle program was retired, and years later, a couple of years later, I think in 2014, when sanctions first were lobbed against the Kremlin, a number of different officials there, in response to the first outbreak of hostilities with the Ukraine war. I remember there was a quote that Russian Deputy Prime Minister Dmitry Rogozin said, who's just known to be prolific on Twitter and elsewhere for these bombastic responses. And he essentially said that NASA should just take a flying leap on a trampoline to get up into space. And yet, despite the rhetoric, there was continued collaboration there. It wound down, though, with the development of the commercial sector, particularly SpaceX, in sending astronauts for the first time on a commercial ship to the ISS. And so, the need for that collaboration is not the same, at least on the American side, as it was in the past 10 years. But there is history there between the Russian, the Soviet at least, and U.S. programs, and indeed the Russian and U.S. programs. There's not that same history between the U.S. and the Chinese. So you don't have this sort of legacy of working together. And you throw that on top of the additional sanctions that we've seen with China, on top of the Wolf Amendment that it was passed in 2011, on top of all the rhetoric that's taking place, and on top of the fact that the Chinese program is quite a viable program. It is making headway in terms of developing real infrastructure up there that we've seen with Chang'e mission. That's going to lead to the development of a permanent boots-on-the-ground station there, probably faster than the Americans will. The Americans will get there in terms of astronauts faster, but in terms of the sustained presence, that there are increasing concerns in Washington that the Americans simply don't have as much of a priority in terms of putting those boots on the ground. So.
Keith, can you add to that and contribute to that with the cooperation and lack of cooperation?
Yeah, well, first of all, as far as the Chinese being able to interact with our spacecraft, there is something called an International Docking Standard, and their docking system is based on the APOS, which is what the Russians, they bought this from the tech. They could dock with the space station tomorrow after a little practicing. And being the space nerd that I am, back in the day, I used to design all the stuff inside the experiments. And I was on another network doing live, whatever it is, when one of the Shenzhou missions docked. And they had the camera going through, and I was like old home week. I was seeing exact copies of hardware, and they have adopted every standard that we have in the International Space Station. The Europeans use it. So it's literally plug and play. And they're actually going after, some of the Europeans. So there is no real technological barrier between China and the U.S. operating. It's all politics. As far as the Russians go, this goes way back. And when I, again, had that job in the 90s, before we even had the deal, we were looking at how to connect the two together. The service module, Zarya, up there, it used to be called Mir-2, the second Mir. And there have been cooperations going for more than a quarter century. And, I got to suggest it's interesting. I watched this, and there are some problems. It's not completely smooth. But when you compare how the U.S. and Russia operate, again, this goes back to the being in a faraway place that's dangerous there have been minor hiccups. There have been a few things bumping into each other and some arguments. And Yuri Gogozin, I've had a Twitter spat with him. Everybody has. That said, comparing the U.S. and Russia and everybody else cooperating up there to what's on Earth, there's a very important lesson, and I may be naive in saying this. If you can get along in a place like that, if you get along in a place in the South Pole, maybe there's a lesson to be taught back to Earth that we're getting out of this, putting those things aside, as was mentioned before. But that said, again, it comes back to not the engineering, because that's easy to fix. It's the geopolitics, it's the wanting to get along. And a lot of the rhetoric we hear now, I remember as a young boy hearing when we did the Apollo-Soyuz. And I worked at Rockwell International at the time. I actually talked to the guys who built the hardware. And it was like, oh, we didn't trust them. Oh, my God. And then they trusted them. And it's like, yeah, they drink a lot. But other than that, they're just like us.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to... Oh, yeah. Go ahead, please.
Well, what's interesting in the context of that, right? So when you looked at the Apollo program back in the 1960s, the U.S. was spending about 4% of GDP in terms of its space program. That number is nowhere near where it is right now. In fact, there's some indications that the space economy might actually be shrinking in terms of overall expenditure. But if you look at the commentary and the rhetoric on both sides of the Pacific, the rhetoric ratchets higher and higher and higher. Xi Jinping has referred to space as China's eternal dream. The head of the lunar exploration program has likened it to the South China Sea and the territorial claims in terms of what the moon constitutes. You have to wonder the value of the rhetoric in terms of driving up the dollars, in terms of where this all goes. So it's hard to know where the sort of the rubber meets the road on this one, right? Is there a sense that there is a real, a burgeoning geopolitical crisis that's happening above our heads here? Could be. Is there a sense that among the brass on both sides that by using this rhetoric, it drums up more dollars for their respective programs? Could be. So, it's difficult to figure this out, particularly in China when the budgets are not transparent at all. And so much of this trees up, obviously, through the PLA. So getting a real read on numbers, particularly in that country, is very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, we might, if we have time, go back to that. Sorry, yes, go ahead, Keith. And then.
Well, it's interesting with the geopolitics because we've sanctioned like everything that moves and doesn't move with Russia. But the one thing that has not been touched is our international agreement and how we run the International Space Station. Why is that? It's very important to Russia. It's very important. You'd think that you'd want to go hit them there, and we don't. And so I think there is a chance that and I'm on Chinese TV a lot, and I listen to them, and it's sort of, the rhetoric is part of the whole game.
Right.
But at the end of the day, they think it's important. We think it's important. The Russians think it's important. And I kind of think that, again, with the Antarctic example, that maybe that's the point. And I'm not a politician, so to speak, but there was this thing about nations that trade together don't go to war and all that stuff. There's a higher purpose that sometimes may be the only way that we talk. And remember Khrushchev and Nixon in the kitchen debate, we'll bury you, and we ended up in space together. Maybe this is the route that we keep things open, where everything else is closed down. I don't know. I mean, I don't think we're going to send secretaries of state up there to have a meeting.
I
wonder, though, because in the context of the need for the ISS now, sure, but the ISS is going to be phased out. And there's all these new commercial stations that are coming online, whether it's Axiom Space or it's Orbital Reef. And so, the old moniker of those nations who trade together don't go to war together. Well, there's less trade that's happening, both terrestrially and potentially in terms of reliance in outer space, right. in the space station. So, as we separate, and the rhetoric ratchets higher, and the technology advances, and more private players are involved, and things like hypersonics are utilized. And, it just, there's so many different aspects of this, and there's so many avenues where things could go wrong.
Right.
And it only takes one time. That's the concern, I would say.
Well, you guys are actually headed right into
something this big.
Just hold on one second. I do want to make sure that people who are on YouTube chatting away with their questions definitely get to ask their questions. And actually, it's segueing right into the sort of private commercial space. So if I can, I want to pull up a question from. It says the question is, if you guys can pull it up in the control room, I'll ask. This is, will this be another start of a race between big, super rich to set their foot on other unknown parts of the moon? And could it affect the monopoly of the big five? So I think this is going into a little bit of what you guys were saying earlier about the, the commercial aspects.
Yeah.
Yeah, Keith, why don't you take that question, and David as well next?
Yeah. The interesting thing is, and I haven't talked to Elon in a bit, but I met him when he was in his 20s, and he just made a bunch of money off of PayPal. And he has enough money at his disposal, as does Jeff Bezos, than virtually any other country's space program. And they both watched too much science fiction when they were growing up, and they don't know any better than to try and do all this stuff. And they're going to go do it. Now, it's great to get government money because that helps, defray the costs. But at the end of the day, they can go offshore, launch from ships. They can do all kinds of stuff that nations probably wouldn't want to do. So, I get this question a lot: is there a space race? Well, you have to agree to be in a race if you're going to compete with somebody. But collaboration and cooperation and competition, it's a multivariate, multipolar world, and it could change on a whim. And again, something this big moving at the right speed could ruin somebody's space station. And it doesn't take too much to send a rock from point A to B in space really fast. And it could happen by mistake. It could be, oops, we didn't do it. The Russians at one point actually destroyed a satellite, and some of the debris came up and was affecting the station, and their guys are living there. This is the more opportunities for things to go wrong. It's not like that movie Gravity per se, but the more players, the more cooperation you can have, and the more uncooperation you can have, and they will invariably collide.
David, over to you.
I think to pick up on that point that you said about watching too much science fiction. I think they all do, frankly. Speaking with different Chinese entrepreneurs in Beijing Center, a lot of them reference the three-body problem. That was that later Netflix special. So it's not just like the Arthur C. Clarke's of the world. I mean, this is, I think in many ways, what's exciting about this, what's truly exciting about this relative to other sort of geopolitical contests is that there is a degree of inspiration associated with all this. And once you sort of parse through the nature of what could go wrong, and there is a lot that could go wrong, there is this sense amongst people that they get inspired and they think about things in the context of, why can't we do this? Why can't we go there? I remember I had a conversation with Doug Terrier, who used to be the chief technologist at NASA. And he was just a boy growing up in Jamaica when the first moon landing took place. And his teacher, Mrs. Simpson is the right name, was reading the Reuters feed of that moon landing, and the class was transfixed, and it just propelled him on this track to go get his PhD, come to the United States, join NASA, work his way all the way up to chief technologist, and you see that story manifest globally. It truly was a global moment, and the more things that we do collectively, humanity, the more that can inspire. Now, I think the question then becomes is that the money that gets shoved into these things are often defense related. The two are sort of dependent on each other. The nature of how the military brass relies on astrophysicists is it's tried and true over the decades here. So in the context of that, it's really interesting. Now, to address the commercial side, there is no question that there's thousands of commercial space companies that never existed, and part of that has to do with that inspiration that's drawn here. But I think we have yet to see a major space company that can stand on its own 2 feet at this point in absence of government contracts. So in that sense, it still is Joe and Jill taxpayer who are funding these initiatives. Now, there's starting to be some differentiation with with Starlink, and the satellite market has always been, probably when you talk about profitability in space, that's at least immediately what we're talking about. But if there's going to be a transition to be, you go from a space to Earth economy to a space to space economy, and really developments of the true lunar economy, you're going to need the types of things that the Chinese and frankly the Americans with the intuitive machines landing in February are trying to make happen. How the geopolitics and the military and the questions of economics and equity and all of these things play into it. That's going to be the question we figure out.
Great. And we actually have a question that brings us kind of back to. Yes, go ahead, Keith.
Here's one thing, and again, I'm 68. I remember I grew up literally grew up watching the space program. I stayed up late watching, listening to the radio reports and coming down to see if the astronauts were okay in the morning. And for me, I remember the impact of watching the landing live on a black and white TV. Okay, that was 50 years ago. I'm 68, and my cohort is moving towards retirement. More than 2/3 of the people on this planet have never seen a human walk on another world. We've seen robots and all that. We've never seen another human walk on another world. So when a Chinese and an American or a European or whatever, when they go back, this is their first lunar landing. It's like doing the same thing again for the first time. And I can't underestimate, I think, the impact that's going to have. We look at what happens when solar storms hit the Earth. We're distracted from a moment from the wars just to look up at it. It's ephemeral, and like 2 days later, it's back to who's killing whom. But again, there's so many people on this planet. I mean, we have a Pakistani payload on this thing. Nepal has had spacecraft in orbit. And, I do think that there's a transformative aspect of this that may tweak it a bit here, tweak it a bit there, so that maybe the stupid crap that could happen won't happen because somebody somewhere says I can make money out of the positive aspect of this, selling whatever it is in space or from space. Starlink is one example.
Right.
I mean, I'll leave it with this. I spent a month in Nepal at Everest. These people knew what satellite phones were, but the notion of what was moving in the sky was a mystery to them till I taught them how to spot satellites. Imagine now, you literally have people that are like 1 or 2 generations away from almost, this robust poverty, can now talk to anybody anywhere from the sky. That does actually impact them. They get it. And what will happen 10 or so years from now when the billions of people who've suddenly had that mindset say, wait a minute, you rich Western people, we want this. I'll stop there.
Okay. Well,
I would say one thing to add on to that point.
Okay, one thing,
if I can just do real quick. There's a reason why so many rockets and engines are methane powered these days. The Intuitive Machines landing was methane powered. Methane powered engines are harder to ignite in space. They just are, right? But there's a reason why. And part of the reason is Mars, right? And I wonder in terms of the amount of methane in the atmosphere there and that can be harvested and, the Institute of Development, when you talk about a real sustainable human civilization or human colony that could be potentially put there. It's something that all the major sort of space titans talk about, whether it's Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, or even Richard Branson. And I wonder if the analogous moment is not astronauts or taikonauts landing, setting foot on the moon for the first time, but it's going to be when they do that on Mars.
Great. And we do have, I want to share a comment and then go to a question. Kevin Barron is a comment saying, I don't think China is in a space race. From what I've seen, they have set a schedule for doing this. It's really a matter of, does the U.S. or anyone else want to react to that schedule? And here's our question. What could be the best and the worst outcomes of China being the first country to explore the far side of the moon? I think we touched on that a little bit, but let's address that. Keith, over to you.
Well, yeah, they're the first ones to land there, but we've had orbiters around the backside of the moon for half a century. And if we, the West, wanted to land something there, it's a matter of just spending the money in engineering. And quite frankly, unless the Chinese send armed forces to shoot our satellite down or something like that, again, it's like Antarctica. I mean, you can pretty much, it's the common heritage of humankind. You can go there and do stuff. I can't fathom why they would claim the backside of the moon or do any interruptive sort of behavior when they've got economic problems back on Earth that they're using the space program to drive. But it's one thing to use space technology to better your country. It's another to just waste money on something that isn't geopolitically important. And the Chinese are, if nothing, geopolitically and long-term minded. So if they're going to go get the far side of the moon and make it Chinese, there's got to be a darn good reason why they're not spending those resources somewhere else. So I'm not worried.
David?
I'm glad you're not worried.
Okay, I'm going to share a quick comment. GWC has a quick question. Maybe there's a quick answer. What's the cost of all this? Do we know? Like, I know you mentioned the secrecy, of the Chinese budget, but how much would this thing, are we talking trillions or, I mean, yeah, I don't know who can answer this question, but it's a good question. David, maybe you have a better idea because I know you've been put a lot. David, do you have a sense at all, or is it just all secretive, like you said?
I do have a little bit of a sense. I wish I had my notes in front of me in terms of the exact numbers. I mean, these are just official numbers that were drummed up. But I mean, right now the Chinese space program is less than what the Americans are spending, with regard to at least their public dollars. Okay. I think a lot of this has to do with optics in many ways. There was questions about manufacturing and resource extraction and power generation and the implications of quantum computing and hypersonics and satellite killing weaponry and direct energy weapons and, and a partridge in a pear tree. But, I think when we talk about this, it's difficult really to get a read on this. And as such, that's why so much of what we're talking about and the conjecture that you'll hear is based on guesswork, educated guesswork, but nonetheless guesswork.
Got it. And there's another great question that we're going to pull up onto a slate so that everyone can read that. Let's stand by and see if you guys can pull it up. There we go. There's no way to verify that China landed on the side of the moon facing away from the Earth, is there? I think that's a question for Keith. How can we scientifically prove this? I guess they could show AI-generated video saying, look, this happened, but how does the rest of the world know when something like this has happened so far away?
How do I know that we're not all AI, and I'm not even here? Here's your moon, okay? And I'm the Earth, and I can't see on the other side. So there's a satellite that they put in orbit around like that. And the signals that come back, we can see them anywhere on Earth that has a dish pointed at that. I'm sure NASA and everybody else is listening. So it's hard in order to fake the landing on the far side of the moon, you'd have to do all but that to fake the signal coming back. So if you're like 90% of the way of landing on the far side of the moon to fake it, why not do the real thing? And second of all, there's a cohort of people who don't think the Earth is flat, all that nonsense. You're going to have the coup factor, the conspiracy mongering factor, everything. But when you see the great nations of the world all being interested in this, China can just tell its billion people, look, India wants to go there too. There's another billion. There may be a few million that think this is a hoax, but there are probably billions that would say, this is great, I want to go. I'm not worried about that either.
That's a great answer. Okay, so now I want to throw in a question of my own that you guys have sort of danced around, which is the difference between the West or the U.S. and China. I think we tend to talk about it in U.S. and China terms, but the Chinese, it's an authoritarian country, which means that they have 5-year plans, they have long-term plans, and this is all state-driven, whereas in the U.S., with the NASA space program, there is a little bit of a commercial element to this, but, you have a new president come in, they decide to slash the budgets. But on the other hand, some people will argue that the U.S. is more innovative. I would love for the two of you to sort of talk about I don't even know if the word cultural differences is the right word, but the differences in the systems and the approach and whether there is one that is clearly better than the other. David, over to you.
I think that's sort of the ultimate question. I mean, I think in terms of, what's better for society, that's a different question than sort of what's going to win out in terms of power and influence. I think we probably can agree on what the answer is to the former. But in terms of the advantages that the Chinese system have, I mean, they don't deal with 2- and 4-year election cycles in which changing priorities radically shift funding towards programs. I mean, that's something that the U.S. program and frankly Western programs, not just with regard to space, but if you just think about any kind of long-term planning, like if you were to establish 5, 10-year, 15-year plans, it's not all that enforceable. I mean, when Obama was in office, he talked about going to the moon in I think it was 2030. That's a different administration. That's a different Congress. That's a different electorate. clearly China has, as long as they maintain the continuity of leadership, which is not a foregone conclusion, I would say, that could change as well. We don't know. Right. And that kind of change would certainly be more radical and stabilizing, one would think. But, China has its own problems. They have population demographics issues that they have to contend with. Obviously, they have, economic headwinds that are posing real problems, particularly in real estate markets. And so, when you think about all of this coalescing in terms of what makes for the best long-term strategy, certainly China has a way of setting its goals and then meeting them. But in terms of the wherewithal of that system and the innovation that's derived in private markets, a lot of that still comes out of the Silicon Valleys of the world. These little cluster centers, not necessarily only in Northern California, but places where you have freedom of movement, freedom of exchanges of ideas. One last point I'll say on that is that the difference maker comes when you have a technology that requires a government buy-in. So, talk of development of a Large Hadron Collider in China that is larger than that in CERN to kind of do the kind of level of particle physics that they just can't do in Switzerland because it's not quite as big. Like that is the type of thing that can draw people in ways and draw the sort of the intellectual capital into places to kind of do the cutting edge science. And so I do wonder about that sort of long term. If there's not a willingness to invest in major science projects in the United States, particularly at a government level, because some of these things are just they're just too expensive for companies. Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk will take you to a certain level, but to kind of get to that next paradigm shifting level of technology shift, you do need government buy-in.
Yeah. Over to you, Keith, on that difference.
I agree 200% with what he just said. And I got to tell you, I've been watching NASA for, almost 30 years now. And after we lost Columbia, I wrote a book with my late co-author, Frank Sitson, who, by the way, was buried in space from a SpaceX rocket. We had this big throw up in the air moment in America where do we go back to the moon? What do we do? And out of this came let's go to the moon. We'll retire the space shuttles, finish the space station. And I was sitting like 20 feet in front of a bush at NASA headquarters, and he said this stuff. And then a few weeks later, Congress said, this is great. Everybody was on board. And then they went off with some, I let 1,000 flowers bloom. We haven't, and they would say, Sean O'Keefe said, the administrator, we haven't done this in a decade or two. We need to really just embrace the Silicon Valleys, the entrepreneurs, everybody. So they went and did this, and they had some ideas, and then Obama came in, Bush too, the second half of the Bush administration came in. New administrator, totally changed. Came up with a rocket, didn't work. Then the Obama folks came in. We've been there, done that. And then the Trump people came in, and they loved it if you could just put up with the nonsense of, the rhetoric that went with it. And it's literally, my hands are waving around here a lot, but it's like a tennis match with the budgets. How do you plan? You can't do 5-year plans at NASA. You can't do 2-year plans. And right now they have 3 budgets they're working on simultaneously. So I associate myself completely with my colleagues' thing there. If you've got the ability to plan, which is what China has done, and if you look at how they do things, it's methodical. They have watched us. They have watched the Russians, the Europeans, and the Japanese. Their spacecraft kind of look Russian, but they're under the hood, they're not. And you see evidence of what happens when you can have a command economy, an infrastructure that is driven by policies. Of course, the downside is what goes with that. So it's one or the other. And then now throw in the private sector, where they've got billions and they could say, I'm going to go to Mars.
Right. Okay, so guys, we are running out of time, so I'm going to do a fire round of questions very quickly. David, who do you think which country is going to have a base on the moon first?
Oh boy,
we have like 60 seconds. So name one and give one reason, one sentence.
Yeah. I think China has the edge at this point.
All right.
I mean, that could change.
Okay, Keith, over to you. Is it also China for you as well?
It might be, and as I said on CNN one time, they said, will China get there first? Yeah, but then we'll come land next to them, roll down our window and say, hi, y'all, where do you want us to park our big lander? I mean, it's going to be almost like they're,
Got
hooray,
it.
China just did something 50 years ago. Next.
Awesome. All right. We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you, Keith Coing and David Ariosto, for sharing your insights and experiences. And to our viewers, especially those who sent in their questions, thank you for your active participation and for making Ask DW a platform for discussion. And don't forget, you can get all the latest news and information around the clock on our website. That's dw.com. Thanks for joining us. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
My pleasure.